Joining us now, very happy to have him with us, is John Abinader. I'm sorry, John, I hope I'm getting your name right.
All of the above. You did it right.
Oh, man, John Abinader. He's live in D.C. He's a senior contributor with Inside Arabia, which is my number one go-to site for news and information on the Middle East, which I cover. That's the one I go to. That's got the best information. That's got the most accurate news. That's not fake. That's true. That's where I get unbiased, unvarnished, unfettered news and information and great analysis. Go to InsideArabia.com, also based in Washington, D.C. John Abinader is also a senior advisor with the American Task Force for Lebanon. John, thanks for being with us today, man.
Glad to be here.
I want to talk about Lebanon. We talked about the coronavirus here for 3.5 hours. I want to get to another topic. You had a great column the other day called, "Is There a Recovery Model for Lebanon Without a Revolution?" And as we cover Lebanon and all the conflict going on there and the various military personnel involved, the U.S. involvement, very muddied. No one really knows what's happening in Beirut right now, who's going to be in charge. Break this down for us, Jean, if you will.
That's a really good question, and it's one I ask myself all the time, particularly since they're trying to mobilize just like everyone else to work against the virus. The problem is that back in the 30s, when the country was first formed, there was an agreement among the leadership that the government would be divided by religious sect, to try to bring peace among all the different groups that were involved. Well, what that's happened over the years, which they've never really put it into law, but it's definitely practice, is that the president is always a Maronite Catholic, the prime minister is always a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, of the parliament for them, is a Shia Muslim. And so those three, there's always been kind of a balance among the three to make sure that everybody was happy. But what that's meant is that now there are 18 recognized political parties based on sects, religious sects. Mm-hmm. And so things are divided up in the country by those sects. Lebanon had a civil war between 1975 and 1990. And what happened in that period is the government literally collapsed. And so the warlords, the heads of the militias, became the government in a sense of who distributed the goods in terms of social services, health services, education, etc. And so that has led today to a government that is dysfunctional and is corrupt and doesn't provide the services except to their own constituents, and that's causing paralysis in Lebanon.
How do you break that chain?
Well, the key here, I think, from what I heard and know from on the ground, I visit Lebanon every year, is that the young people and those people who are demonstrating in the streets are really calling for an end to corruption, an end to the sectarian basis for the government, and transparency in business dealings with the government so that people can start mobilizing the private sector, can start mobilizing the talents that they have. As you know, Lebanese are all over the world, mm-hmm. and they're very successful people. But in their own country, they're stymied by the culture of politics there that inhibits you unless you know the right people mm-hmm. from getting ahead. So the real question is, how do we bring about change through new elections, through a new electoral law that gets rid of the sectarian influence, through empowering people to have more say over their own communities and by decentralizing from the national government to local governments. So I think the models are there. The real question is, because the country is now in total economic collapse, will the political elites give up their power, or at least some of their power, so that the economic reforms that are necessary to move the country forward will happen?
Where was John Abinader, senior advisor with the American Task Force for Lebanon, also senior contributor to my go-to news and information site. Go to InsideArabia.com, InsideArabia.com. They're going to give it to you straight. Jean, let's get to the political ramifications going on in Lebanon right now. Their new young prime minister, Hassan Diab, he's got backing, though, from Hezbollah. What is the U.S. position on him? Is he thread a thin line here with his support from Hezbollah? How does this work politically?
That's really a really important point to make, and that is that Hezbollah has been able to manipulate the power political power in Lebanon because of its allegiance or coalition with a leading Christian party, the Free Patriotic Movement. Because of this alliance between the Christian party and Hezbollah's allies in Amal, which is the Shia party, they effectively control enough seats in parliament that they can block anything from moving ahead. And so the prime minister, even though he's probably a very good guy, and I happen to know him, and I think he's got all the right intentions, his ability to maneuver things through the parliament and through the council of ministers, where most of the power resides now, is very, very difficult. So I think despite whatever good motives he might have, it's going to take external influence from the outside world as well as internal demonstrations to show the government that it's got to become serious, because the lower middle classes, small businesses have been wiped out. Over 220,000 people are now unemployed, 220,000 people out of a workforce of only 500,000. So almost 50% of the people are out of work. Small businesses, over 1,000 have closed. So it's really a desperate situation for Lebanon that's only going to change when the government changes, and that's going to take a real shift in how politics are done in Lebanon.
Sean, give us your insight on U.S. involvement, both covert and overt. Like there's the, U.S. involvement that we see, but then there's a behind the scenes. Bring those to light for us, Sean.
What the United States has done, which I think has been useful, is through its maximum pressure campaign on Iran, it has affected Iran's ability to provide money and support to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So that's been very helpful. It's also been very helpful, but that the U.S. government has not allowed any of its support to Lebanon, either military support or economic and social development support, to go through the government. It all goes through the NGO community or civil society, or goes for the Army, it's for training and materials. Nothing goes to salaries and pensions and operations. Now, that's been very successful because it hasn't allowed the government to use U.S. aid, either economic or military aid, to manipulate the political situation in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. So it's also contributed to people who were demonstrating to feel that the United States is neutral in this, in the sense they're not going to be coming in as they did in Iran in the 50s or in other places and come down against the demonstrators. And so that's really, really important that America continue to show, both through direct means, its pressure on Iran and its support to non-governmental organizations in Lebanon, that it supports the people of Lebanon, and it really supports them being able to free themselves from this yoke of outside interference, whether it's Iran or Russia or Syria or anyone else.
As you know, in the U.S., Hezbollah sells itself as a legitimate political party in Lebanon with legitimate elected members. And their view is, look, we have a democracy here in Lebanon. We got elected, therefore we should have a seat at the table. What's your problem? I mean, that's been their mantra from afar. And if you don't study it closely like some of us do, and yourself, John, and you don't go there and really understand what their reality is, the average person says, yeah, well, okay, somebody voted them in. They can't be that bad. How do you reconcile that?
Well, I'm not going to go to the extreme example that I could of the Nazis being elected in Germany, but at the same
That's
point...
a great example. I mean, that is the best example. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, democracy doesn't guarantee anything.
Exactly. You can say the Nazis were legitimately elected, and of course Hitler was not. He got beat, I think, by von Hindenburg. But during that election, he got a bunch of seats in the Bundestag, right, that eventually led to him becoming a chancellor, and then leading to the disaster that happened after that. So that's a great example.
What we know is that any kind of democracy is a balance between two things, the state and society. And as long as they're in balance, the checks and balances that we build our federal system on, then a government can go forward and the society feels comfortable that their rights are going to be protected and their services are going to be provided. What happens when the political elites become too strong, then the people start to say, oh my gosh, who's going to save us from all this? And they turn to people like Hezbollah to provide the services and support that they can't get from the government. And that's what happened in Lebanon over so many years. And the truth is, frankly, that the it's a classic issue not only in Lebanon but all through in fact, we're seeing it in the United States, and that is the conservative forces who are opposed to change are much better united than the people who are on the more progressive side, who fight among each other all the time. And so Hezbollah was winning seats with 30% of the vote because they said to their people, you'll vote for this candidate, and the other side were 7 people running for the same seat.
Right.
And so they were picking up, yes, they did pick up a lot of seats in parliamentary voting, but it was because of the disunity of the opposition more than the reality that was the best thing for that district or that region.
And also, they were filling the need void, right? Because they were going to voters and saying, look, your other political systems and candidates have failed you, and you vote for us, and we will provide you with things. That was the other.
Yeah, when the government collapsed, as I said, during the Civil War, the political parties moved in, and the warlords moved in as the people who provide essential services. The government has never recovered. Even today, there's a parallel power system. Telecommunications costs are astronomical. So people are looking around saying, who's going to help us? And if they come in and say, hey, vote for us and we'll do X, Y, and Z for you, and that's what they've done. They provide health services, education services, social services. They take care of widows and orphans. I mean, they've been doing it for 20 years. And so the government has a lot to do to catch up, and so it lacks a lot of credibility. And this is why the demonstrators are so successful, is because people do believe it's corrupt and inefficient and doesn't really care about the majority of the people in Lebanon.
You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network. We are with John Abinader. He's Senior Advisor, American Task Force for Lebanon. John is also a senior contributor with Inside Arabia. Inside Arabia, my number one go-to news and information site for what's happening in the Middle East. That's where I go. Go to InsideArabia.com. Inside Arabia also based in Washington, D.C. They have a great team. John, how did you hook up with Inside Arabia? That's where I go.
When they were first organizing as a news source, they came to me because I've been in Washington like you over 40 years, and my beat has always been in the Middle East, and I'm well known for doing weekly analyses of both the Maghreb, which is North Africa, and the Middle East, the Levantine area. So I've been around a while. They knew my work, and so they came to me and said, we need a fresh voice, and would you write for us? And I said, sure.
It's not easy to do the work that you're doing also, John, because I remember, it was about like 2019 that the head of the IDF Northern Command really blasted Hezbollah. I'm trying to think of his name off memory. I think it was General Baram. Does that sound familiar? Amir Baram?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
And he said that, basically said that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization and that their allegiance was not to the Lebanese people but to Iran. Remember that he made that statement? There was, the New York Times, I think, had a big piece on it saying that it was an irresponsible thing to say. But Hezbollah's done the same thing in Palestine. They legitimately get elected. They figured out they can win democratic elections by simply splitting the opposition up and then providing services to people in a political void where they can't have any. And
I've written about this before. It's characterized, Hezbollah is characterized as a state within a state, just like the Palestinians were a state within a state in Lebanon before the Civil War, which was fought largely because of the Palestinian presence in Lebanon and the breakdown of the system. Hezbollah has to decide, are they going to be part of the Lebanese political fabric and therefore a political party like everyone else and act like a legitimate political party, or are they going to be a proxy of Iran and take their orders and their allegiance from Tehran? That's what Hezbollah's got to decide. Are you Lebanese or are you an Iranian proxy? And right now they're behaving as an Iranian proxy.
And, well, that's where they get their funding.
That's where they get their funding, they get their training, they get their supplies, their military presence. But at the same time, Iran calls in the chips, and thousands of Hezbollah soldiers have died in Syria, for example, and they're dying in Yemen, and they're dying in other places. And pretty soon, the Shia community's got to get tired, just like we did, of body bags,
Yeah,
coming home.
You get tired of it. Of course, in the U.S., even though President Trump campaigned on getting out of Afghanistan and Iran, and even though we're all tired of it, we can't seem to get out. Remember when the president tried to take 1,000 troops out of Syria? I mean, you would have thought Washington, you thought this coronavirus is bad? Remember that 7 days where everybody in Washington was running around with their hair on fire like it was the end of the world because 1,000 troops were coming out of Syria? Remember that? It was like a few months ago. I mean, that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was so much that we were pulling the troops out, but that we were taking. In some cases, people said we were abandoning our Kurdish allies.
Right.
The reality is, we let them absorb 8,000 to 10,000 casualties and deaths fighting against ISIS with us, and they were doing most of the work. And so that was it. It was saying, how does this show that we're liable to our allies to withdraw? And that's really what the issue is. It wasn't Syrian oil or anything else. It's when can the U.S. word be trusted? And I agree with you. I think the president, both in Iraq, Iran, and Syria, was handed a bad deal. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But I think that the United States has also not played it as well as it could. It's a lot of, we have trapped ourselves historically in a lot of situations, Afghanistan, for example.
Exactly. And look, for people like me that are anti-interventionists that were with President Trump from the very beginning, from the coming down the escalator, one of the key tenets of that three-legged stool was to get us out of these wars. I just want out. You know, sometimes you just have to say, damn the consequences, or you'll never get out. But let me ask you this. Okay, I'm going to cut right to the chase. We got about 3 more minutes. So what does Jared Kushner want in Lebanon? And I go right to Jared because, you know, he's got this big Middle East plan, which is likely going nowhere fast. But what is the Trump administration's objective? What is success for them in Lebanon? Let's say he gets reelected. It's 2023. What does success look like?
Unfortunately for the Lebanese, the recipe from Jared Kushner is, number one, that the Palestinian refugees, of whom there are 200,000 registered and probably 750,000 who can go in and out of the country, they would become permanent residents of Lebanon, which would destroy the balance between all the existing Lebanese groups. So that's number one. Number two, they would have, by some way, a strip along the southern border of Lebanon, the northern border of Israel, that would be demilitarized somehow to keep Hezbollah from bringing enough tension between the two that some unintended consequences would lead to a war, which would be devastating for both sides. And three, I think that it would bring Lebanon into, unfortunately, because it would be the pressure from the agreement would bring Lebanon into the orbit of Syria, which would be a real shock to the system in Lebanon, since so many people are opposed to Assad and his regime in Syria. So I think it has no good consequences for Lebanon. They can't say, the U.S. government can't say, hey, if you do this, we'll give you all this development money. It would destroy the integrity of the state to have to all of a sudden absorb all these Palestinian refugees and create war zones in the south and on the east with Syria and Israel.
Tough end game. Great analysis. John, I really want to thank you for your time. If somebody in the administration called you up and said, hey, John, what's the one thing we can do better in Lebanon that we're doing now, what would it be?
Continue and expand aid to the Lebanese armed forces and economic and social ESF funding to NGOs, and target sanctions very carefully with regard to Hezbollah and their allies in Lebanon.
Outstanding segment. John Abinader, I want to thank you for being with us. Senior Advisor, American Task Force for Lebanon, also a senior contributor to Inside Arabia, based in Washington, D.C., the #1 news and information website for news and analysis on the Middle East. I don't go anywhere else. I get up, I go to InsideArabia.com. They're based here in Washington, D.C.